What you're going to discuss tonight is really important. What I want to capture with my keynote is less very specific ideas. You're not going to get a specific idea from me that's going to go revolutionize the world. What you're going to get from me is some thoughts on some questions that can really help your process and some things that we've learned from companies from around the world. Now, in order for me to do this, I think it's really important for you to understand a little bit more about my background. I very much appreciate the introduction that I received. I have kind of an interesting background in that I'm an academic and a consultant now, but I actually started much more, I had two goals in life. The first one was I wanted to create a company. And then once I did that and sold that company, I thought, this is great. And I wanted to create another company. But always in the back of my mind, I wanted to write and research and do some teaching as well. And so I was not a very typical doctoral student. I went back to get my PhD when I was in my early 30s. And so at the time I was married and I had some two young kids with me. And I had a very interesting experience there that I'll share with you that I think can help to give you a little bit of background, not only to my approach here, but also something that might be helpful to you. Now, you can imagine as I'm going through this PhD process, and I had been out running companies, I wanted to rush through, and I wanted to get through, and it was all about tasks, and how many classes do I have to take, and how quickly can I finish this? And then you get to the dissertation process, and you really just want to plow through this thing, and it starts to drain on you after a while. And I remember about a year and a half into writing through my dissertation, I was excited. I was almost done, and I went and I very excitedly presented it to my dissertation chair. And he read it, and then he came back to me, and he very quietly pushed it across the table, and he said, "Tom, you're not yet sufficiently concerned with the question. Start again." I had traveled to 3 countries. I had written nearly 250 pages. I had researched hundreds of articles. I had interviewed dozens of managers. I had crunched statistical numbers for as long as my fingers felt like they were going to bleed. "Tom, you're not yet sufficiently concerned with the question. Start again." When I got over kind of the shock of initially hearing that, what came from it was a research project that was something entirely more powerful than I ever could have imagined. The interesting thing is, my question never changed. The research question was the exact same, but my approach to it, my openness to it, the way I really dug into it, the way I really tried to understand the value of what was going on in these experiences that I was interviewing people for, just really opened a very, very interesting thing. And so when you see what we did with Harvard Business Review, I think you'll understand that a little bit more when you understand the background that I just shared with you. Now, the other thing that I want to share about my background is I fly a lot. This year alone, I'll probably log 100,000 flight miles on 4 different continents. That's taught me a couple of things. The first one is we have lots of differences. Despite those differences, we're not entirely unique. In fact, we are far more similar than we are different. And that goes for when I was in South America 2 weeks ago, and when I'm in Europe today, and when I'll be in Asia 2 weeks from now. These differences are really important for us to understand, though. And I think what we really share in common is we're trying to constantly figure out how is it that we can drive more acceleration, more performance, and then how is it that we can keep from failing? I mean, we share the exact same hopes for success, and ultimately we share the exact same fears about failure. And we're all operating in the exact same super dynamic environment. Let's take a look at just a couple of things that'll give us a sense for some of the dynamism that we see within this environment. The first one is we've been part of research that's trying to extrapolate, trying to predict into the future and trying to see what level of turnover we're likely to see within the Fortune 500. To our best estimates, this is what we've surmised. The Fortune 500 is likely to turn over up to 50% within the next 15 years. Now let that kind of sink in and put that into perspective. The last time we saw that amount of turnover with some of the world's largest companies, how long do you think it took? 50 years. More than 3 times the amount that we're seeing right now is what it took previously. Now, can you envision a world of no Coca-Cola? Or maybe Coca-Cola, but it's irrelevant. Or it's not the number one position within soft drinks. So this is kind of the dynamism that we're experiencing and that we're really trying to understand. And so in order to understand that a little bit more, one thing that I did is I helped lead a team that did some research for Harvard Business Review. And what we were really trying to tackle is, what are great companies doing? And more specifically, what are great big companies doing? I know that we've got a wide range of people in the room here. I'm specifically speaking a bit more to companies that are trying to understand ideas and then trying to get those ideas sold into their companies. But I hope that those of you who might come from a little bit different experience can also find some interesting principles in what we're going to talk about. Now, what we found was 3 key questions tend to help highlight whether or not these great companies are going to consistently renew themselves. So let's take a look at these. But before we do this, I want to take you on a little bit of a journey, a little bit of an experiment here. Anybody in the room ever been to San Francisco? Oh my goodness. That's a lot more than I expected. You love San Francisco. That's where you're keeping your hand up even longer. Okay. How about the Exploratorium in San Francisco? Anybody familiar with it? As a kid, I spent my childhood in San Francisco, and there's a science museum there that's really, really neat. The interesting thing, though, is the only thing I really remember from it was probably the least technologically advanced experiment that you could find in the Exploratorium. There's lasers going on everywhere, but there's this one small kind of drab experiment that they've got off in a corner that I've tried to replicate for you here today. And the way the experiment goes is you step back from a wall, and you're about, I'm going to use meters, not feet, so 3 meters, right? And then you're looking at this wall, and the operator spins you around in a circle and puts a blindfold over your head. And then they put a big tassel. Now, I understand that tassel doesn't translate very well into German, so just think of a thick rope that would go down the middle of it. And then the object is for you to look at that thick rope and look at the board, and they pose a question to you. Which side of the board is painted a darker shade of gray than the other side? Now, I promise you there's a difference in what you're looking at on the screen. So just take a quick second within yourself and try to determine which side is the darker shade of gray. Okay, how many of you say left? Come on, we're going to interact. Let's do this more as a conversation than just me speaking to you. So I've got some votes for the left over here. We're going to get groupthink going on. Okay, what about the right? You're on the left too? We've got some on the right, some on the left. Okay. How many of you think I'm lying and they're the exact same? Oh, okay. This is good. Is that my Americanism coming through, or is that what you actually think is going on here? It's funny, I was in Cuba a couple of months ago, and I kept getting people saying, "You have the face of the CIA." I come to Austria, and I'm juvenile. I go to Cuba, and I'm CIA. I promise I'm not as interesting as any of these people are saying. Let's take a look. What happened? There's no bar anymore. All right, so I'm gonna plant 3 questions for you, and then within these 3 questions, I'm gonna tell some stories. What I want more than anything is for you to really internalize these questions. I can give you a list of things. That list of things will probably wash over you and you'll forget about them. What I really want you to do is think about how you can personalize these questions to your experience, and then how you can have these questions personalize themselves to your groups and to your teams. The first question that we found that companies do a really great job of, that are continually able to renew within this Harvard Business Review study that we did, is how will you see what others miss? How will you see what others miss? And when you think about this previous experience, it's very easy to see things, to have that determination when there's nothing in our way, when there's nothing blocking our view, when there's nothing psychological, there's no bias, there's no previous experience, there's nothing clouding our vision. But you put that bar on, and all of a sudden it's a guess. It's a crapshoot. So we need to understand within our own experiences, what kinds of things are we bringing to the table within our companies, within our own practices, that serve as these bars that might keep us from seeing interesting ideas. Now, you came here, and one of the titles of the talk is How to Become the Next Howard Schultz. And I think it's the ire of the entire European world that Starbucks is headquartered in the United States and not the capital of coffee. To which I have to ask, why wasn't it you? Perhaps even more importantly, and let's think about the experience of Howard Schultz. So if you look at his story, Howard Schultz was nobody. Howard Schultz was a regular employee of a small company named Starbucks that didn't even have coffee houses. They sold coffee beans out of a retail shop. They had 2 or 3 locations. It was completely insignificant, tucked away in Seattle, Washington. And they sent Howard Schultz on a buying mission. They sent him to a conference in Milan, Italy. Now, Howard Schultz did something that other people very easily could have done. One of the interesting things is I've gone back and I've looked at the rolls of the number of people who had attended that conference just over the previous decade. It totals over 10,000 people. So there's over 10,000 coffee executives from the largest companies in the world converging on Milan, Italy, looking at the exact same experiences, walking the exact same streets, spending time in the exact same city, and yet Howard Schultz sees something that nobody else sees. Now, what did Howard Schultz see? And for those of you who came here to get the next technological revolution, I think these types of things can help us understand that. But Steve Jobs taught us very, very well that you absolutely cannot start with the technology in mind. You've got to start with the consumer. You've got to be more of a sociologist. You've got to understand the behavior, the intimate understanding of the human experience. And then you try to pair technology to that, or whatever the product or service might be. So Howard Schultz says, you know what, I'm going to have a little different experience this time. So rather than just sitting in my hotel, taking taxis to the exact same locations, spending time with the exact same people, he started walking. And he determined that he was going to walk every street he could find in Milan because he wanted to find an interesting idea. Now, at the time, you have to think, what was coffee? Particularly in America, coffee was a commodity. It was something that you paid pennies on the dollar for a cheap caffeine fix in the morning, and there was nothing experiential about it. And Howard Schultz starts walking around Milan, and he starts seeing this really interesting joy that coffee served in a social environment was bringing to people. He'd never seen it before. It piques his interest, so he starts to talk to him. He starts to understand what's going on. And then he hypothesizes that coffee served in a social environment would allow Starbucks to charge much more for their cup of coffee than previously. A very simple observation, but the question I want to pose for you is, why him? Why not the local Europeans? Why not the tens of thousands of other people who had visited the exact same conference at the exact same time? Let me share another quick example. Is Walmart here in Austria? No, but everybody's familiar with Walmart, okay? For good or for bad, right? As a business case, it's hard to argue with what Walmart has become. Now, interestingly enough, Walmart has a very similar story. Sam Walton was considered a nobody. He was considered somebody who couldn't have really good ideas. In fact, he was considered undereducated. He was considered somebody that was certainly not technologically advanced, in no way sophisticated, and he mightn't have felt very uncomfortable in a sophisticated room like this. Now, Walmart started, and what they were trying to do was create low-price mechanisms for getting products to as many people as possible. The interesting thing about Walmart is, and we love our European friends for this, it seems like some of our best observations came from trips to Europe. Sam Walton was on a trip to London, and the number one thing that was keeping Walmart from being able to grow was they couldn't figure out just-in-time distribution. They couldn't figure out how to get their products to another location faster and how to turn their inventory cycles much faster. So he's walking around some retail stores in London, and he comes upon one little retail store, and he notices that their flowers are fresher than any flowers he'd ever seen. So what does he do? He starts talking to people. He then strikes up a conversation with the store clerk, and the store clerk says, oh, it's because we have this little system, and this little system talks to our flower person, and the flower person brings the flowers. They know as soon as our flowers are going to run out, and it brings the flowers to us as soon as they know that's going to happen. So he's fascinated. He sets up a meeting with the store manager. The store manager shows them a little, and this is the beginning process, but a little snippet piece of software that communicates to their providers, and their providers are then in turn able to replenish their products as quickly as possible. Walmart would not be what it was today without that very simple, very straightforward, but very grounded in understanding human behavior and asking questions about the human behavior. So what does he do? He goes home and he says, guys, I absolutely need you to come up with a system that allows us to get our products here faster. Simple observation. What did it do? It created the world's greatest distribution network. And again, for good or for bad, we can say about Walmart, what I want you to understand is these companies aren't inanimate objects. They're not these huge behemoth beasts that don't move, that aren't driven by ideas. Every single case that we researched originated with one person, and that one person was able to transmit a unique observation to other people, get other people excited about it, and turn it into something more. In some cases, it originated with top management. By and large, and as we'll see in a later example, it didn't. Now, what can companies do? Now, the first thing that we understood, and this might seem a little bit straightforward, but I want you to think about, again, in your own experience and within your own companies. How do you expect of yourself to be part of great ideas? Think about your day-to-day activities. How much of your day-to-day activities are spent in routine? You wake up in the morning, you do the same thing. You get in your car, you go to work. You go to work the exact same way. You go through your day in a very similar routine manner. You come home, we do relatively similar things. We know even in retail shopping, our grocery lists every single month are nearly 90% identical, repeated, constantly, comfortable, routine, habitual, over and over again. That's not going to generate great ideas. That's going to create a very comfortable, very warm, very soothing environment that makes us feel good, or at minimum, it makes us feel less conscious about what we're doing, but it's not going to generate great ideas. So what can you do in your routines to expect of yourself that you can have the opportunity to see a great idea. Now, the other thing that I really want to emphasize here is it doesn't matter where you're from. It really doesn't even matter what your background is. We saw great ideas coming from everywhere. But the one common thread was they consciously expected and believed that it was important for them to do. And because they believed it was important for them to do, they had to break their routines. They had to break their norms. They had to put themselves in different positions at different times. Sam Walton, if you guys can envision what he would look like, think of the most stereotypical human being American you can think of, with jeans and cowboy boots and a real weird hat and speaking with a Texas drawl. Can you imagine him walking through London? He looks ridiculous. It probably felt ridiculous to him. But because he was willing to do it, he was able to find and spot things that he just would not have seen otherwise. I don't want to give you exact, you must do these 3 steps, but I do want you to think about these experiences, and within these experiences, I want you to place a few different tips. And the 2 things, if first of all, it's important that we understand what to look for and then how to look. And the 2 things that we want to look for are, is there joy going on that needs to be scaled? So in the coffee example, there was very high potential emotion, real quality joy going on, but it was reserved to a certain part of the world, or it was reserved to certain pockets. We want to observe those joys, those emotional experiences, and then try to find a way to translate them or try to find a way to amplify them or scale them. The other one in your example is the perverse juvenile system, I think was what you said, where you're looking for friction. So you're either looking for joy that we can scale out, or we're looking for friction that we can solve. Both of those, if you just walk out here, and hopefully over the next week you'll kind of do an experiment with yourself, and just carry a little journal. One of the neat things that Howard Schultz did was he always just had a little hand journal with him, just a little pocket. And he was looking for 2 things. Is there joy here that hasn't been scaled? Or what in the human experience is frictious? What is difficult, or what is pent up about it? And how could we go about solving it? 2 things, 2 straightforward things, but it'll change the way you observe the world around you. And more importantly, it'll cause you to think about things, and it'll help you to break your routines just a little bit. Now, companies can do this as well. Infosys, everybody's familiar with the very radically successful Indian firm Infosys. They do it in a very public way. So their expectation is every business team within the company will come up with 2 ideas that they think will radically disrupt the company. And then they create a big forum, and people have to publicly present these ideas within that big forum. And so you're spending your days doing your job, but in the back of your mind, you're also thinking of this expectation that I'm going to have this public forum that I need to present these ideas to. And so you're constantly kind of percolating. You're constantly thinking about, what would that look like? How would I go about doing this? What kinds of ideas would have a big impact? And then they really want you to come up with ideas that would be completely uncomfortable for the firm's current operating procedures. Now, this will be a rhetorical question, but think about that. Why would you want your employees to come up with ideas that would be uncomfortable for your current operating procedures? And I think within a sophisticated room like this, you can start to think of why that would be really valuable for a company to do. Okay, so question number 1, how will you see what others miss? Question number 2, how effectively do you initially validate ideas? Now, we're not talking about wide-scale proof of concept with massive amounts of resources spent. What we're talking about is in its very initial phase, in that Howard Schultz initial observation phase, what could he then do to help other people want to get on board with the idea? One thing that we find is all new ideas are considered illegitimate until you can get at least one other person to try to accept it. One of the ways you can help to get one other person to try to accept it is to initially validate it. You need to reduce the risk to your companies of wanting to listen to this initial new idea. Now you say, well, that's great if you have high position or if you've got a lot of political clout or if you're in top management. Let me share a brief example of what happened in Kentucky Fried Chicken and really why Kentucky Fried Chicken owes its massive success internationally to a franchisee that it tried its best to reject his ideas. Now, if I were to ask you where the largest non-Chinese franchisee of Kentucky Fried Chicken is, where would you say? France? Okay, India would be a really good guess. Ecuador and Colombia. Ecuador and Colombia. And more specifically, there's more density of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Quito, Ecuador, than almost anywhere in the world. One of the things that's really interesting to us as Americans is Kentucky Fried Chicken is not very popular in the United States. I mean, it kind of is, but not supremely like it is in some of these other markets. So how does a small franchisee in Quito, Ecuador, rise to such status? Well, the history is this individual mortgaged everything, came up with every ounce of money that he could come up with to buy one franchise, one restaurant that he wanted to put in Quito, Ecuador. And it was about to fail. And so he did what any good entrepreneur would do. He just borrowed more money. And he put another restaurant. And what was it going to do? It was about to fail. And then he starts to go in. And now he doesn't have answers. He doesn't have tassels. He says, I don't think I figured this out. I don't think I have all the answers to this. I want to take away that black mark, and I want to just look at this. I want to understand this experience. Why are things happening the way they are? And what he noticed was people loved the chicken, but they were not very interested in anything else on the menu. And the chicken alone was not a reason to bring them into the market. So, being the brilliant man that he thought he was very excited for his observation, and he ran off and he called and he tried to get a meeting with Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they put him off, and then eventually they met with him, and he presented his idea to them. What do you think their reaction was? You're an idiot. We're Kentucky Fried Chicken. We know what's best. You're the franchisee. You just do what we say. Just work harder, spend a little bit more money, go in a little bit more debt, and we promise you it'll work. Now, that wasn't really satisfying to him because it was all of his money. So he could have done two things. He could have gotten really frustrated with that scenario, or he could have done something that would help the company understand the value of the idea. So what he did is a little bit rebellious, but something that I would highly recommend to anybody, and I would hope that you within your companies would allow your people the latitude to do this. Working within the Kentucky Fried system and working within the regular point of sale system, what he did is he created a small, tiny little experiment within one restaurant location. And within that experiment, he took a poster board. Literally, it cost him $5, and he wrote on that poster board, if you would rather have local beans and rice and Ecuadorian side dishes with your chicken, walk through this line. Then he created another poster board, and he said, if you would rather have the local menu or the regular menu as you currently see it, walk through this line. Cost him $10. What do you think happened? The line starts filling up for this local fare. So now he's got the best of the chicken, but he's also got lentillas, he's got arroz, he's got the local environment there. So he says, okay, this is kind of interesting. So then he does it in one more location, gets the exact same results. He's now out maybe a total of $100. And now he says, okay, I need to formalize this. So he goes back to Kentucky Fried Chicken and he says, here's the exact same idea I presented to you just 6 months previously, but I've got a few more things that I want you to look at. And those few more things that he wanted them to look at was the simple data of what had occurred by simply splitting the lines and saying, I want you to come down this line versus this line. What's Kentucky Fried Chicken going to do in that scenario? Tell them, no, you got to go back to South America and keep losing money? No, they have to listen. The power of validation, even in its most initial phases, wherever you are in the idea phase, is creating a little bit of validation, reduces the risk of other people to take a chance on listening to your idea. Now, we can talk in the panel about a couple of different ways to do that, but however you do it, it's very important that you do it. In fact, we saw that within our study, those who were able to do a simple, I'm talking less than $200 spent on validation, had a 50% increase in their willingness or their ability to get their ideas sold to other people within the company. All right. Question number 3. How will your best ideas be heard? Now, what we see is there's 2 things that we have to understand here. The first thing is the messenger, and then the second thing is the message. An interesting thing happens when we come up with an idea. For some reason, we immediately almost become jealous, and we want to protect the idea. And it's ours, and we want the glory for it, and we want to be the one known for it, and we want to express it. The problem is, sociologically, that's exactly the wrong thing to do if we want to get other people to jump on board with the idea. You see, the interesting thing about ideas is very few people actually buy ideas. Most people buy the influence of other people. So if you want to get an idea sold into a company, the worst thing you can do is try to do it yourself. The best thing you can do is try to find other people who are advocates within the company who can help to get that idea through. It's a very, very interesting experiment, but we tried to take people and get them to individually try to get the idea to other people. And when we added just one more person to the group, so now you're not selling the idea individually, now you've got 2 of you. 40% increase in the idea's willingness to be accepted by the company if you just had 2 people. It didn't even matter if the other person contributed to the idea or not. There was something validating, there was something legitimizing about having somebody else involved in the idea. So there's 2 things we can think about here. One is we can do that very informally, which is you've got an idea, and then rather than trying to go it alone, find somebody who's influential within your group, and you have to be willing to share the glory. You've got to be willing to share that idea with them, because 2 people makes a bit of a crowd, and a bit of a crowd is far more legitimizing, creates far more confidence than you individually, even if the idea doesn't change between you and the other person. You can do that informally, or you can do what ConocoPhillips does, which is they very much formalized it. Now, ConocoPhillips, I'm realizing, is not a very well-known company here, but it's in the top 10 in the Fortune 500. It's a massive oil and gas producer in America and really globally. Abner Portillo was their manager within Central and South America. And he noticed that their lubricants just weren't selling the way that he expected them to sell. And so what he did is he thought, I'm going to go out and I'm going to observe and I'm going to try to come up with a good idea. And what he found was people were just using lubricants different in South America. So he tried to get the idea sold into Houston. He said, people are not going to buy these big 55-gallon drums of oil the way we're trying to sell them here. They want them smaller. They work differently. They pay in cash. They fix their trucks themselves. And so he tried to get the idea sold into Houston. The idea was not sold into Houston. They did exactly what Kentucky Fried Chicken was going to do. They spent more money on marketing. They spent more money on trying to educate them. He went through a validation process, but really the key to what helped him get his idea through was he found an advocate in Julie. And I don't want to use her full name because I don't have full disclosure there. But Julie was somebody that was very influential within the firm. She was somebody who people listened to. Now, interestingly enough, she wasn't the CEO. She wasn't even chief anything. We don't want to think about influence in terms of titles. We want to think of influence in terms of who do people genuinely respect, because that's who people turn to when they're trying to understand whether or not they should buy off on an idea. So he got Julie involved, and Julie was then able to help him get that idea through. So what I want you to think about within your companies is, do you have a strategy for advocacy? Do you have some sort of mechanism to get your ideas through? I'm not talking about idea boxes. I'm not talking about intranets where people just post ideas. Those don't change anything. Advocacy changes things. That means you literally, ConocoPhillips loved this idea so much that they now build advocate into certain parts of different people's job title. And part of their job is, your job is to help other people get their ideas sold into the company. Advocacy makes an enormous difference in not getting ideas deflected at the door before they're able to come through. The second thing to think about is message. Steve Jobs was famous for saying, at Apple, part of our job, part of our culture, part of what we're really trying to accomplish here is we want to have wonderful arguments. He didn't want to fight. But a wonderful argument means we are incredibly merit-based. We are candid to the bone. We are able to say exactly what we think, when we think it, how we think it. And ultimately, we're creating a system here where our best ideas always win. One of the great fallacies of Apple is people think that Steve Jobs came up with all the ideas. He came up with one. The Mac was really the one that he originated. The iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, he might have had a part in it, a little hand in it, but most of those ideas actually came from people outside of that core upper management team. What would Apple look like today if it hadn't created this environment where people can be really candid? If they hadn't created this environment where advocacy really helped to take new ideas and kept them from getting deflected at the door. So 2 quick questions that I want you to think about here really briefly. On the first one with the messenger, how many big ideas that you've executed this year have come from outside of your top management? How many of your big ideas that you've actually implemented have come from outside of your top management? This is a really nice test for you to understand whether or not advocacy is working in your group. Because the reality is, if we just play the statistics, how many of us are top managers? A small handful. How many thousands of people do we have working within our organization? So as a statistical measure, we should have far more of our big ideas coming from this large pool than this small handful. So think about it. If that's not the case, really consider how you can do a better job of creating advocacy within your organization. The second one is, do people really say and think, even if it's hard, what they really think? Or do they say what you want to hear? Now, I know within hierarchies and within politics, sometimes it's very easy to just say what your boss wants to hear, or it's very easy to say what's politically expedient. If you want to kill an idea environment faster than anything, create an environment where people aren't authentic. Create an environment where people can't genuinely express what they actually really think, what they actually really feel about a scenario. Okay? So 2 quick things that I want you to think about as we're kind of wrapping up that part of the discussion. Now let me turn to, I'm going to show just a quick video here. Now, when we initially started this work, we actually thought that we would find something genetic. We thought we might find some sort of DNA. We might find something very common within the characteristics. Maybe blondes would be better at certain things. Maybe people who grew up in one country under one sort of regime would be better at certain things. We didn't find any of that. We found great ideas coming from all over the world. Remember, this spans 4 continents, all different ages, from all different backgrounds, different genders. There was really no one great demographic characteristic that we could pinpoint. But what we could find were people who were sufficiently concerned with the questions. And the questions they were consistently and sufficiently concerned with were the 3 questions that I just presented to you. So ultimately, that's your opportunity. If you think about that, the dynamism that we talked about with the Fortune 500, for some of us, that'll freak us out because we want things to remain the same. We want to hold tight. We want to stay pat. We want to be firm. But I hope for everybody in this room, you see the flip side of that, which is incredible opportunity. It's a brand new opportunity. It's a brand new slate. It's a white page, and we're rewriting that page consistently. The future is there for those who are sufficiently concerned with the questions. Appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.